All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is David Schoenfeld. I direct the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. And I'm going to be talking to you now about supporting children in the aftermath of grief and loss. So I'm just going to ask if people have any questions as we're going, that you just place that into the chat. And then Vanessa is going to be looking at those and she will let me know if she wants me to answer the questions right away or whether we'll just save it till we have some time at the end to answer questions and have more general discussion. So I'm going to be talking mainly about how do we help children grieve after the deaths of someone they know, but I also do want to acknowledge, of course, adults grieve as well. And so a lot of what I say is going to apply equally to adults. So if I don't say it's just for children, then it means it's really for everyone. But I do want to point out that understanding the experience can help with adjustment, but it doesn't eliminate grief. So you all have relevant experience and training, but there shouldn't be the expectation that the topic isn't tied to some emotional reaction as well, particularly for those of you who are in communities where there have been losses that occurred recently, like in certain parts of Maui. So please monitor your reactions to the content and just adjust your participation accordingly. So if you want to at any point, just turn your camera off, step away for a second, please, you're invited to do so. Now, the recent wildfires in Maui have caused widespread distress among both children and adults, but I want to start by clarifying that not all the distress probably relates to trauma, but it more likely relates to grief and loss, which is why that's what I'm focusing on. Our society has of late grown to appreciate the important impact of trauma on children, resulting in a call to become trauma informed, which is important, but we've been much slower to recognize we also have to become grief sensitive, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on. I remember responding to a community shooting that had occurred, and there was a teenager who had experienced the death of, he was not shot himself, but the person on either side of him was shot and killed. And so he went back to school once over the next month or so, only stayed for an hour or two. He had declined all counseling and he was spending most of his time at home. So I went to his home to visit with him and I asked him why he wasn't getting counseling. He said, well, all they want to do is keep talking about the shooter. He said, I've had trauma symptoms. And he went over what they were, trouble sleeping, jitteriness, trouble concentrating, etc. And he said, but they only lasted about a week and I've gotten over that. And I said, then why aren't you in school? And he said, well, it doesn't feel right being there without her. And when I went for further clarification, he was on a date with his girlfriend that he planned on marrying, and she was on one side of him and was shot and killed. And he said, it's just not right being in school without her. So I looked at him and I said, well, maybe you're grieving the death of your girlfriend. And he looked surprised and became quiet. He thought about it and he said, that's it. And if someone's ready to talk to me about that, I'll go for counseling today. I just don't want to keep talking about the shooter. So he was clearly in a traumatic event. I don't think there was any question about that. And he had some trauma symptoms initially, but his primary issue was actually around grief. And there's a tendency, part of what surprised him was no one had even suggested that he might be grieving. So there is this tendency for us to always rank trauma as higher or more pressing than grief, and that isn't always the case. And so you really have to look at both. And the interventions and supports that we offer to children who are grieving are actually quite different than trauma treatments. So, at a very simplistic level, when you're addressing trauma, you're focusing on the person's reaction to something that happened. You can have complex trauma, and it may have been multiple things that happened, but it's still responding to something or things that happened. But when you're dealing with grief, you're trying to help people cope with the persistent absence of something important to them, rather than the way that the person died or how that loss occurred. I was on the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission. I remember at the end of the initial first school year, one of the parents came and mentioned that she opened the yearbook and noticed that the photograph of her child that had died had been removed, as had the pictures of all the children and staff that died that day. And she looked at us and she said, what were they thinking? It's like they never existed. Now, I coordinated the response for Sandy Hook for the first week, but did not continue working directly with the school because I had another job commitment to be pediatrician and chief at a children's hospital in another state. So I just couldn't stay and provide that level of direct support. So I can't really tell you exactly what that yearbook committee was thinking, but I have talked with others and similar circumstances. And they say to me, we don't want to put the pictures in because they're trauma triggers. And I go over, they're not trauma triggers, they're grief triggers. If it's pictures of people being shot, that is a trauma trigger. But if it's pictures of the people that they care about, those are grief triggers. And that's different. And so we really need to discern between the two, because although people don't like grief triggers either, they prefer feeling the sadness for someone who has died than to forget about the person they loved. That's why people go to cemeteries. That's why they have funerals. Those are activating. It does activate the grief that people have, but forgetting that is even worse. And so I try and help people figure out: are you talking about grief triggers or trauma triggers? Because you need to discern between the two. Now, with that context, let me start now talking about how do you support kids that are grieving. So the first thing is to recognize that even outside the context of a pandemic or a wildfire, grief is common in the lives of children. About 5% of US children experience the death of a parent, and about 90% experience the death of a close family member or friend. And that's data from prior to either of those events. Now, most children will adjust even to major loss, but bereavement has a significant and often long-term impact on learning, social and emotional development, behavior, and adjustment. Now, schools, children's programs, pediatric healthcare providers, etc., can provide a supportive environment to grieving children. And it doesn't require that they receive bereavement counseling from these groups, but rather that they have an empathic presence and a supportive presence for them. I interviewed one classroom educator, and she talked about supporting a kid who had come back to middle school after the death of his mother after a hospitalization. Teacher did not know that the mother had died. She only knew that the mother was hospitalized. So she was very surprised when the kid came back and said his mother had died. She gave him a hug and started to get a little bit choked up. And she said, your mother, or what can I do? And he apparently just got embarrassed and he said, please don't do this. So she said, okay. But know that when you're ready, you can come and talk to me. My door's always open. Everyone's door's open here. And she said he never did come back to talk about it. But he did come up to her after about 3 weeks just to say thank you. And when she asked why, he just said, I just wanted you to know thank you. So I said, okay, you're welcome, and I don't know what I did. And he just responded, you were here, and I didn't have to talk about it. And she said she realized then sometimes kids don't want to talk about it, but they do want to know that you care and that you're there and that you were aware and ready to make appropriate accommodations, which I'll go over later. And so she used a metaphor that I really liked. She said it's like a dance. I take the first step, and if the student's ready to continue the dance, fine, we continue the dance. If they're not ready, it's okay. We could just stop and listen to the music together. And I think that's really what you do in situations, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's wildfires. You're just present as an empathic and supportive individual, and you listen to the music together. So let's talk about how you do that. Well, first off, we have to recognize that many children and their families may not actually notify the school when there has been a death of a family member or friend, and many children and adolescents may just simply not appear to be grieving when you see them. So let's go over some of the reasons for that. One reason is that adults may communicate unintentionally and over time that death is not something that you talk about openly. When a young child approaches someone and says, my mother's going to have a baby, then most people will engage a 4 or 5-year-old in a conversation, even if they don't know them, and ask questions like, is it going to be a boy or a girl? Are you looking forward to being a big brother or a big sister? What's that going to be like for you? But when the same child approaches someone and says, my brother died, I'm going to a funeral, they don't continue the conversation in most situations. And when children bring up things with surviving family members after a death of a family member, often the surviving family member starts crying and the child just assumes that I did something naughty, I made mommy or daddy cry, I'm not going to do that again. And picks up very quickly, you're not supposed to talk about this, it's inappropriate. And they will go ahead and try and support the parent who's actively grieving, giving that parent or caregiver the false impression that somehow they're adjusted to the loss. But adolescents will do that too. It's not just young children. I remember one nurse came up to me in the hospital, and what had happened was um, her son had gone out with some friends to go swimming from a boat and dove into the water. It was a lake and never resurfaced. They actually don't know the reason why he died, but he just died suddenly. So she was pretty devastated by this, as you would imagine. She took off a couple months till she was ready to come back to work. And then she was back at work for about a month and a half or 2 months. And she came to see me and she said, I'm really worried about my 16-year-old son. He was doing fine for about 2 months, and then all of a sudden he stopped doing well. And so he came in and he confirmed it. He said, yeah, I was doing okay for about 2 months. And then I couldn't concentrate in class. I started feeling sad and depressed. I was having difficulty sleeping. So I asked him, why do you think you were okay for 2 months? And he just looked at me and goes, I don't know. I have no idea. So I just looked at him and I said, sometimes it's hard to see your mother grieve. And he said, if there was one more night where she cried herself to sleep on my shoulder, I was just going to lose it. So the issue is that kids will take care of the adults around them and even postpone their grief if what they need to do is take care of the others that care for them before they're even ready to start to experience or express their grief. Now, there was a dad in the household who was very supportive as well, but this 16-year-old was just an empathic young man, and I could see why his mother was literally and figuratively leaning on him. So the issue is kids pick up pretty quickly, you're not supposed to talk about this, so they don't. But there are many other reasons why they may not appear to be grieving. Really young children may not understand what's happened, or they may not understand at least the implications. I remember talking to one dad, his wife died in a car accident, leaving him with 2 young children. And he looked at me and he said, I live in dread of the day my daughter has her first period. Her mother should be there to support her, and I can't do that. And I felt like saying, you do know your daughter's 5 years old. Like, you've got years. Why are you thinking about that now? So the issue is adults tend to think when someone dies, we lose that person. We call that the primary loss. But we also lose everything that person does for us or might do for us in the future. And those are the secondary losses. Adults often go right to all the secondary losses. My wife died. No one's going to be able to support her when she wants to breastfeed her first child. Or, my husband died. Who's going to walk her down the aisle when she gets married? The kid could be 2, and they still think all the way into the future. I've had people really look very far into the future very quickly. But children tend to grow into their grief, and they appreciate those secondary losses sometimes only when they are confronted with them. So they do miss their parents, caregivers, siblings on these important occasions, but they sometimes don't anticipate that. So that's one of the reasons why they might not seem as upset at the time they first find out, even if they understand what death means. But they may also understand what it means and understand its implications and then just feel too overwhelmed by their feelings. So they don't want to talk about it in the school counselor's office because then they have to walk out of that office and go to math class. And then they think that just isn't safe in school. Like, I won't be able to pull myself together. I need to wait till another time. Or they may not want to talk about it in the pediatrician's office because then they have to walk into the waiting room in 15 minutes. And they may not think they'll be able to do that. Or children may express their grief indirectly through their behavior or attempt to work their feelings out through play. So there are many games that have death as a theme that children play. The first game about death begins in the first year of life, and it's played across cultures and throughout the world. So what happens is when infants are first born, they don't have what we call object permanence. Out of sight is literally out of mind. 2-month-old really can't grieve when a caregiver leaves the room because they don't have an internal mental representation of them to be able to remember them and miss them. But once they have object permanence, which starts at about 6 to 9 months of age, comes in phases, then they start to remember important caregivers when they wake up in the middle of the night, and sometimes they'll start crying until they are reunited. It's a developmental milestone that children have. And at about that time, they start playing the same game in multiple cultures. In the United States, we call it peekaboo. And people have said it's the first game about death. So what happens at peekaboo is the child fixes their gaze on someone. There's separation as if the person has died. There's heightened concern and awareness, and then joy at reunion. And then they play it again. So there's a ritualistic quality where they keep playing it. I personally think it's a boring game, so I don't really need to keep doing it over and over again. Children are driven to do this. So you always have to ask, why is it like every 9 to 15-month-old knows peekaboo and you can engage them in that game whenever you wish? They will play it with you, even if there's something else going on and even if they don't know you. So it's interesting that peekaboo is actually Old English and it translates literally to alive or dead. That is what the game is about. And there are many other games that children play that have death as a theme, and often adults are really unaware that's really what it's about. But I assure you the kids are aware of it. So children may play it and express it through their play, but sometimes kids understand it, know about it, are not terribly overwhelmed by it, but they still wish to keep it private. So I worked with New York City schools after 9/11, and there were a number of families that decided consciously with the children and the parents that they weren't going to disclose to the school that a family member died in the World Trade Center attack. The kids said, I don't want to be one of the 9/11 kids. And I'm sure we were also seeing that during the pandemic, where kids were saying, I don't want to be a COVID kid. Don't tell the school that mom or dad died of COVID. So there are many reasons why you don't see children grieving and they don't tell you they're grieving. But because of the prevalence of grief, the fact it lasts a long time, you should assume you can go into any classroom, any group of 15 or 20 kids, and there's a child there who's grieving. So we really should always presume that there are children who are grieving, even when we have no reason to think that's the case. Now, as I said, a lot of times kids don't talk about it, their families don't. And in turn, many adults are worried they don't know what to say that'll make things better, and they're just afraid they're going to say the wrong thing and make matters worse by unnecessarily upsetting children or adults for that matter. So let me go over some well-intentioned comments that might not be the best to share with grieving children. Now, I do want to say that I am only talking about the context when it's acute grief, the death has occurred fairly recently, and you're in a relationship with a child where you are a professional and they're a client, patient, student, whatever the relationship is. In other words, it's not your own child, it's not a friend, it's not a family member. Not to be crass, but you're paid to take care of the kid. Kid isn't there for your benefit. It's that you're taking care of them. So that's the only context that I'm referring to now. A lot of this may apply in other settings as well, but I just want to focus on that. So the first thing is don't try and cheer up survivors by making statements like, I know it hurts right now, but you're going to feel better within a short period of time. Allow them their grief. Allow them to grieve for the amount of time that it takes. Anything that begins with at least should probably be reconsidered. Things like at least he isn't in pain anymore, or at least you were able to spend the holidays together. I know your brother died, but at least you have a sister. You really shouldn't try and minimize their distress. That isn't helpful to them. I think sometimes we do that because we don't like to witness grief in children or in adults. So we want to make it better. We want to make the distress go away so we don't have to see it. That doesn't make the distress go away. It just means you can't help them with it. So we really want to make sure we allow them to grieve and we don't encourage them to be strong or cover up their emotions. You should feel free to express your own feelings and demonstrate empathy, but I wouldn't state, exactly how someone else feels. So you might say something like, I realize this must be extremely difficult for you, or better yet, I can only begin to imagine how painful this must be. But then ask them what it feels like. Avoid statements such as, I know exactly what you're going through, because you can't know that unless you ask them what they're going through. I wouldn't say things like, you must be angry. Let them tell you how they feel. You shouldn't tell them how they ought to feel. But it's also best to limit sharing your own personal loss experience with grieving children. And this is, in the context of they're a client, they're a patient, they're a student. In that particular case, your loss experiences may inform your understanding of grief and loss, but you don't need to share that with the child. Keep the focus on the child's loss and the child's personal experience. Learn from your own experience, but don't share it with kids. And really what you want to do is allow the child to be upset and suspend your judgment. A lot of times I see people say, well, is that a normal reaction? Well, acute grief can be pretty dramatic. And I usually just allow people to grieve the way they choose to grieve. And I don't make judgments on it, with one exception. if they are placing themselves in imminent risk or placing someone else in imminent risk, then that is a psychiatric emergency and you need to deal with it. If they're suicidal or homicidal, or if they're drinking and about to get in a car and drive, or if they're abusing drugs in a way that's acutely dangerous, then you need to intervene to protect safety. And I can go over this in the question and answer period. I've had situations where kids are grieving. They've also been suicidal. You really need to intervene to make sure that you're keeping them safe. So I, I'm just qualifying my comment of just allow them to be how they are as long as it's safe. If it's not safe, it doesn't really matter to me what they've been through. We don't, we need to protect them if they're going to hurt themselves or hurt someone else. Now, the kids may feel uncomfortable talking about it, and adults may be uncomfortable talking about it because they don't know what to say. But some adults are also worried they're going to say or do the wrong thing because they feel ill-informed about another person's culture. This is a major issue I found during the time I spent in Maui. That a lot of concern, understandably, about not necessarily knowing certain native cultures, or at least outside people coming in and not understanding. Now, there are differences in cultural practices, but honestly, the fundamental experience of grief is pretty universal. And yes, we should recognize there are a range of ways to experience and express grief, particularly around the mourning rituals that we use in different cultures. But we can explore ways to bridge the cultural differences once we understand what the person wishes or normally would like to do. And that way we can help grieving children and families of all backgrounds. I really don't think we should ever step away or stay away from a child who's grieving simply because we're not sure exactly how they mourn in their culture, their race, their ethnicity, etc. We should ask them for information. So ask questions when you're unsure what would be most helpful for a particular child or family. But I would really hesitate to make assumptions based on what you think is the way people mourn in someone of what you perceive to be their background. Because assumptions may actually result in stereotypes that cloud our perceptions and make us miss opportunities to be helpful. So I was supporting one Amish family after the death of a young child, and I was visiting the home, and I knew something about Amish culture, having spent some time in the community and having provided care to families who were Amish in the past. So while I was there, I was talking to the grandmother, and at one point she stopped and she pointed to a framed photo on the wall of her granddaughter. And she said, "This is a picture of my granddaughter that died." She explained to me one day the grandchildren were over and they were outside playing, and a tourist who was a photographer stopped and was taking pictures of them. She was about 5 at the time. And so what happened was the grandmother went up to the photographer and said, "Sir, we're an Amish family, and we consider photographs to be graven images according to what it says in the Bible. So that violates our religious and cultural beliefs and practices. So I'm going to ask that you respect that and not take pictures of the grandchildren." But apparently her granddaughter in particular was so excited because she had never had her picture taken, because of course she hadn't, because it violates their religious and cultural beliefs. So she said, "Grandma, please, he's a photographer. He's going to send us a copy. I've never had my picture taken. I really want it." So the grandmother looked at me and she said, "You know what? I was just so embarrassed about how awkward this had become with my granddaughter begging me and this photographer wanting to do it." She said, "So I simply said nothing and let it happen." And then she points to the picture and goes, "What a gift from God. Otherwise, I wouldn't have this to remember her." Now, I knew that Amish don't generally use photographs as transitional objects because they do violate their cultural and religious beliefs. But if I had communicated that to her, that that was my understanding, I don't know that she would have been able to tell me that was what she was doing. So what I tell people is, yes, it's good to be aware as much as possible of other cultural practices. Um, and you definitely need cultural humility to know that you don't know how everyone else will do something. But just approach the family with an open mind and open heart and help them identify and communicate what's important to them about their cultural practices. And then you work with them to find solutions and compromises when the realities require some modifications in the cultural practices. So when I was in Maui a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about, well, what can you do if families normally bury the remains of individuals that have died, but many of them, their bodies are not retrievable within the homes that burn in sections that had severe fire damage. And so we talked about, can you allow them to collect ashes in a safe way so that they may be able to bury that, disperse it, out at sea, whatever their cultural preferences are. But let's see if we can come as close as possible. And I know that that's something that they're starting, I think, this week, that we're talking about allowing families to go back to the areas that were burned. So part of it is saying, let us, saying to them, I want to know what will be useful for your beliefs, your practices, your community, and yourself. You also need to realize that people come from blended backgrounds. So individuals might have varied backgrounds in their families of origin. So I'll just share with you that because of my last name Schoenfeld, and because people tell me I look and act Jewish, I'm not particularly sure what that means. My dad came from an Orthodox Jewish family, and that's the name. My mother was a devout Catholic and went to Catholic schools, and actually she won. So we were all baptized, the kids, and I was an altar boy. But everyone just assumes I'm Jewish. The number of people that have recently wished me a happy Yom Kippur, I just email back and say thank you, but it doesn't really, it feels awkward to me. I have people who talk to me in Yiddish, and I keep saying I don't actually know any Yiddish, and they keep going, and they say, well, you must know this word, and I'm like, actually, I really don't know any Yiddish. And my home, the realtor sold me a house that was within walking distance of a synagogue. He made a point of telling me you'd be surrounded by Jewish families. I just felt, I said, thank you, that's thoughtful, but part of me is thinking, why are you telling me this? I know it was a way to connect with me on a shared cultural belief, but it actually just distanced. Now, I was able to look past it and say, that's really thoughtful. I'm glad he's trying to do that because he thinks I have a certain background, but I don't. And so it really didn't help. So I just say to people, don't just memorize practices of different cultures and backgrounds. Just be aware there are differences and do your best, but mainly be open and communicative. So, I've had people say to me, well, if it's a Muslim female and she comes into practice, you really shouldn't hug her unless you're a relative and if you're male. My reaction is kind of like, I don't hug any female patients. Very rarely would I even offer that, and I would always ask permission because they could be the same background as me, but have been sexually assaulted or just find it uncomfortable or not want to be that close to me. So I think you just need to know their differences. I wouldn't just try and memorize them. I would explore them with people. So I went over what you shouldn't do, but I told you should talk to kids that are grieving. So let's go over how do you start that conversation. So the first thing is start the conversation by expressing your concern. Let kids know you've heard about their loss and you're available to listen and offer support. Be genuine, so kids can tell when adults are authentic in their communications. So if a child has just experienced the death of her uncle, don't say something like, oh, he was such an incredible man, because if they look at you and say, when did you meet him? And you have to say, oh, I actually never met him. Then that's just not authentic. But what you can say is, although I didn't have the chance to meet your dad, from what you described, it sounds like he's both a very important man in your life and someone I would have liked the pleasure to have met. I'm so sorry you experienced this loss. So you can always be genuine and show your concern. Just make sure you stay authentic. Then I would invite conversations. So just simple, direct, open-ended questions like, how are you and your family doing since your mother died? Is a good way to start the conversation. And then listen and observe. So listen more and talk less. You can share observation about children's behavior or responses if you do it in a non-judgmental manner. So a teacher might say, ever since your mother died, you've been quieter in class. How are you and your family doing? Is a very nice way of starting a conversation, providing an observation. But I wouldn't say, ever since your mother died, you're not participating enough in class, because that's judgmental. And that suggests that you're criticizing the child's behavior.
So sometimes it's subtle phrasing in the way we speak, but it also is often not that subtle, and it often really reflects our judgment about what they do. Observations are fine as long as it's not judgment. And then limit personal sharing, as I already mentioned. Keep the focus on the student, their experience, their feelings, and offer practical advice. Kids may be hesitant to go back to class or into social settings because they may be afraid that they're going to be asked questions about the cause of death that seem uncomfortable to them or intrusive. Um, so rehearse with them. What would you say if that worries you? What could you say when someone asks, "How did your dad die?" Or if they come up and they say, "I understand that your house burned wildfire, and your mother died. What happened?" Then you could say things like, you could rehearse the answer, something like, "Oh, thank you for your concern. Right now, I find it still difficult to talk about. I'll come back to you when I'm ready to talk. Thank you for now. I know you're there when I need it," or something like that. Just rehearse some type of response that they can use. You can offer reassurance. Don't minimize their concerns, but let them know over time they're probably going to be able to cope with their distress better. So there is a more positive future out there, but it's really when they're ready. And let them know you're going to be there to help them while they're getting to that point. And then maintain contact. So at first, kids may not accept your invitation to talk or your offers of support, but questions evolve over time. Just remain available, concerned, and connected. It's also useful when supporting grieving children to identify and address guilt reactions, which are quite common. Young kids tend to be very egocentric. They assume they control external events through their actions and even their thoughts. They also have a limited understanding of the true cause of death. So when someone they care about dies, it's important they understand it. So to make sense of that, they may come up with explanations that rely on magical thinking because of their egocentrism, and they may assume that there was something they did, didn't do, or should have done. It could have been somehow or some way prevented the death of someone close to them. That results in guilt after death. But even older children and adults will feel guilty even when there doesn't appear to be a logical reason for them to feel responsible. And at some level, at least unconsciously, people become anxious when the death of someone close to them has died and worry that it will recur. One way to reduce that anxiety is to assume that you had some personal responsibility, and therefore you have an illusion of control. If it's your fault that it happened because you didn't call when you heard there were wildfires in the area, or you didn't go back home when you were supposed to be going over to another relative's, or you didn't go over to your grandparents' house when you came home during whatever the reason, whatever you did, if you can say, well, that was a mistake and it's my fault that this person died, then that can reassure you temporarily, like, oh, I just don't make that mistake again, and no one else I care about should die. The problem is it's an illusion of control, so it doesn't work. It's an illusion. And so it doesn't prevent further deaths, and it leaves people with guilt. And that guilt makes it hard for them to cope with the loss that's occurred. And that's a common reaction. It isn't just little kids, it's also with adolescents and adults. So I always find it helpful when talking to children and adults, just to let them know that when bad things happen, we feel badly. But when we feel bad, it often means we assume we did something bad. Thoughts and feelings don't cause someone to die, or I'll say, I know there wasn't anything you did that contributed to that. But I wonder, did you ever feel that way? A lot of kids tell me they do, or a lot of adults tell me they do. And I will tell you, after 30 plus years of doing this, I've only found two or maybe three situations where I didn't find at least someone who felt guilty in the setting of a disaster or crisis or after a death of someone. It's just so common. And so you really want to be looking for it and reassuring individuals of their lack of responsibility. Now, for those of you who are working with people over time, you may reassure them and they may not. They may not say, sometimes they're not that involved with the person that died, and they'll go, oh, I just thought that, but yeah, other people have that. Well, maybe it's not my fault. I have had that happen, but it's usually when there's a classmate that's died from when they weren't even present, so there really isn't any logical reason why they would feel guilty, even though they come up with it. And sometimes they'll accept, okay, that's a phenomenon, I shouldn't feel guilty. But a lot of times they stay feeling guilty because otherwise they just feel helpless, and that's worse in some ways. So then what I ask people is, did you do this intentionally? They'll go, no, of course not. And then I'll ask them, well, what is it going to take before you're ready to forgive yourself? And maybe we can work toward getting to that place. So I think guilt is an important thing to uncover, and sometimes just simple explanations is enough to at least have them disclose their guilt. So it's usually not enough for them to, relinquish those guilt feelings. Now, some of you may be working with very young kids, so I did want to go over some of the basic concepts that children need to learn in order to understand what it means when someone dies. But first, let me just go over this cartoon from Calvin. He calls for his mom and he says, a big dog knocked me down and he stole Hobbs. And he said, I tried to catch him, but I couldn't, and now I've lost my best friend. And his mother says, well, Calvin, if you wouldn't drag that tiger everywhere, things like this wouldn't happen. Calvin points out, there's no problem so awful you can't add some guilt to it and make it even worse. So please look for the guilt reactions. And now I'll just transition into those concepts that I mentioned. So there are 4 concepts. The first one is irreversibility. When someone dies, they don't come back after they've died. I've seen a lot of times in writing and people saying that only adolescents can understand this. Actually, really young kids can understand this. So I remember discussing this with my own child when she was less than 2, and I couldn't really explain. They just didn't know the word dead. And then I finally said, all gone. And she just looked at me and she goes, all gone? And she went to a bag, pulled out a baby book, turned it to the page where the toddler turns over the cereal bowl. It's in a lot of books. And she and says, all gone. And she pointed to the picture, said the person's name, said, all gone. And I said, yes. And she never asked to see that person again. So it's not a hard concept to understand. Very difficult to accept when it's someone you love. But that's hard for adults. So children can learn it. They also need to learn finality or non-functionality. All life functions cease completely at the time of death. It's not that they don't move very much, it's that they don't move at all. And so the issue is very young children don't know what are life functions. First, it's animism. Everything's alive. Then the television dies. We say things like that to confuse kids. And so because it no longer speaks, so then it's dead. But what starts happening is children realize only things that move are alive. But then trees aren't alive and cars aren't alive. Then it's self-locomotion. Then you get robots start to seem alive, but trees, it takes a long time before they really realize that growth is a life function of living things. So the issue is, it isn't until someone understands all the life functions that they necessarily assume they all end at the time of death. So if you have a young child, say 4 or 5-year-old, and you have them draw a picture and say, we'll put it in the casket of your mother before we bury her, you need to make sure they understand that's symbolic. Mom isn't going to be able to sit up and look at that picture when you're not around. Otherwise, that means that she's still in pain, she's hungry, she's feeling trapped, she's essentially being buried alive. So kids will be preoccupied with physical suffering of deceased if they don't understand finality. Inevitability means that everything that's alive eventually dies. If you don't think it's inevitable, then you have to figure out why someone was chosen. And there's usually 2 reasons they come up with. One is that the child is being punished by having someone they love die, or the person did something so bad they have been punished by being killed. One leads to guilt, the other leads to shame. Neither lead to the desire to discuss it, and neither lead to adaptation. And so that's why the last one is causality. There are physical reasons why people die, because if you don't know the reason, you tend to elaborate ones that are more likely to lead to guilt and shame. Now, most children actually understand these concepts at young ages, by 5 to 7. But even children that are much younger can be helped to understand these concepts. I've seen children under 2 or 2 years of age understand these concepts. And please understand that I'm just talking about comprehension. Acceptance is even more difficult, but the understanding comes in, usually by 5 to 7, sometimes younger. Now, religious explanations can be shared with children, but they shouldn't be relied upon as the sole explanation of death, because religious concepts tend to be abstract and children tend to be concrete. So I had one one boy who was told by his parents, I think he was about 6, that his brother died because he was such a good little baby. God wanted him back at his side as an angel. So he made it clear when he went to church, which was God's home, he wasn't that good and shouldn't be called to the other side. So every Sunday they woke him up, and he did everything he could to misbehave during church so he wouldn't be struck dead by God. The explanation that was given that was comforting to the parents was really terrifying to the child. And this lasted for months, and they didn't realize it until sorry, I just feel like I'm going to sneeze. So hopefully I apologize for that. And it wasn't until I brought this up months afterwards and started asking some questions that they were like, oh, yeah, he does misbehave, but only in church. And then I said, what was your explanation? And they looked at me and they said, oh, no, did we do that to him? And part of me felt like saying, yeah, you did. Like, please sit down and explain to him why his brother died. I think he's feeling like that he's at risk too. Now, most of what I talked about is just around children who are typically developing, but children who have intellectual and neurodevelopmental disabilities may actually face unique challenges after a death of someone close. Children who can't communicate well verbally often express their distress in nonverbal ways. They may become more aggressive or more disruptive in their behavior. You may see changes in sleep, eating, or toileting patterns. Some children may actually increase self-stimulating behaviors. They may rock, chew on their clothes or fingers, or become more intolerant of changes in routine. So I remember one child who was nonverbal and had autism spectrum disorder, and his mother died. And the way that he showed that was more self-stimulatory behavior, so he started banging his head more. They assumed he had some medical problem and escalated the workup from exam to x-rays to CT scan and finally hospitalization. And it wasn't until the nurse observed him while he was an inpatient that he banged his head whenever his mother was mentioned. And so she realized that's self-soothing behavior. And he got discharged and sent home because the last thing you want to do for a child who doesn't tolerate changes in routines and can't communicate and is highly distressed is place them in a hospital setting, separated from those they love, and feeding food that they don't eat, being in a room they're not familiar with. So he really just needs to be discharged and supported. So efforts should be made to reestablish routines quickly if there's been a death. In some situations, when kids need to relocate or their caregiver has died, you need to establish new, consistent routines. And explanations should be geared to the child's developmental level and to the child's unique concerns and stressors. So ensure that they have, the basic facts about what's happened, and that they also understand those concepts of death. Now, I'm going to, just in the interest of time, I wasn't planning on going over all of this, but you will have access to the slides. And the next one really talks about what happens when children go off to college or to the military or pursue careers in another location. Those transitions can be difficult even in the best of times, but they're really hard. You've recently experienced it. Because like in college, for example, kids are separated from virtually everything that's familiar and comforting. Their family, their friends, their own bed, comfort food. My kids told me whatever they serve in college and the dorms is the opposite of comfort food. They really hated it. I couldn't understand why they hated it so much, but they did. There isn't their place of worship. They can't go back to the ocean. Let's say they go to the mainland, and the way they derive comfort is to go spend some time, contemplative time in the ocean. You may not be able to do that. They find themselves instead in a foreign environment where they're expected to make friends and have fun all the time, and that's difficult to do grieving. They lack privacy, even in their bedroom or bathroom. There's no place where they can express their emotions openly without judgment or risk of alienating potential friends. And then they're unfamiliar with the counseling and support services available on campus, and the academic impact of grief may make them anxious about the new academic expectations at college. So they feel self-conscious about their grief. It heightens their sense of isolation. It just makes it really hard. And children may also worry about their parents and other family members they left behind and think it's selfish to pursue their own education or career when family members are struggling. And so really, if you can reach out, and just reach out to kids that have gone someplace else for whatever reason it is, help them figure out where can you get the support locally and let them know you're still here and you care.
So let me turn now to academic accommodations. So it's common for students to have at least temporary academic challenges after the death of a family member or close friend. And you're going to see this from the majority of students dealing with wildfires or still dealing with the pandemic. Pre-existing learning challenges can become worse and new ones can develop. So it's important that we offer academic support proactively. Don't wait for students to begin demonstrating academic challenges, and worse, don't wait for academic challenges to become academic failure. Schools need to be a source of valuable support for children whether they're grieving or traumatized. But if academic expectations even temporarily exceed their capacity to learn, then school becomes a source of additional distress instead of a source of support. So assist children in identifying the level of academic work that feels appropriate and achievable at the time. So you might need to change the assignment. Kid might have a term paper, but really prefer to do a project with a partner. Some kids, though, when they're grieving, don't like socializing or being with other children. They feel uncomfortable in social situations. So you might have a group project, and you might have to convert that instead to an independent assignment. Maybe you have to change the focus or timing of a lesson. I have now had, I will tell you after wildfires, the book Fahrenheit 451 often comes up. You should be thinking about, you wouldn't teach that class when there's been a wildfire in the community. It's just insensitive. But I've had other books where children have been shot in the head. Mice and Men is one that's come up multiple times. And if the child was killed through a gunshot wound to the head, you don't teach that book in a classroom. It's just insensitive. You might want to reschedule or adapt tests. You can do 504 plans or modification in the student's IEP, but just give them, maybe weight their grades differently. So you weight grades and scores that came before the wildfire more in determining their final grades. Or maybe what you do is you exempt them from some testing, give modifications like testing in a quiet location with more time. So you give supports according to what they need and what will help them continue to learn. But it's always a balancing act because you want them to be prepared for the next year so they have adequate academic progress. And you don't want it to be so boring in class that they're not learning. But at the same time, you don't want to overwhelm them. And if you have 30 students, you probably have at least 30 differences. And actually, if you have 30 students, you probably have at least 90 because they'll change during the day. And so there may be some things that they can handle and some things they can't. And so you have to keep checking. So the next thing that I wanted to turn to before I just share some resources or talk about the impact it has on us is grief triggers in the classroom setting. So grief triggers are sudden reminders of someone that died that cause temporary but still powerful emotional responses. And those grief triggers can be anything that remind children of the person that died. Even just the comment, please bring this home and have it signed by your parents, may remind children who had a parent that died that they don't have parents anymore. Or it may be that you talk about a location in history class, and that's where they went on vacation last together. It could be almost anything. And so children will talk about these grief triggers. I have a really nice video clip where one kid is talking about the fact she's a high school student that in her biology class they were talking about blood vessels, and she answered a question about what can happen with an aneurysm, and she said, well, it can burst, and if it's in the brain, the person can bleed to death. And she looks at me and she goes, well, it's really ironic. Teacher can say something that doesn't mean anything to her and not realize how much it really means to you. Her father died of a ruptured brain aneurysm. And talking about that in class was really difficult for her. The teacher didn't know that. And then she said that, and I asked, has, any other examples? She goes, well, actually today I was just talking to my best friend and we were joking about how hard a test was. And I said, I'm going to have a heart attack. And she said, I'm going to have an aneurysm, and started shaking and trembling. And she looked at me and she goes, I didn't tell her that's how my dad died a couple of years ago. She doesn't know that. And so it's not her fault. She's a wonderful friend. But these triggers happen all the time. So what do you do about it? Well, one thing is you warn kids that they do happen and work out a safety plan. Maybe there's someplace they can go, or somebody that they can talk to when they're feeling upset. And work out a signal that doesn't draw attention to the kids so that they know that they can leave. I had one teacher just left a tissue box by the door, and it was worked out that if the student was grieving, he just took a tissue from the box and walked out the door, and she knew it's a grief trigger. She knew where he was going or who he was going to speak to, how long he was going to stay,
and what he was going to do if he needed more help or assistance. And he didn't have to ask. If kids know they can step out when it gets overwhelming, they usually don't have to step out, because it's really that powerlessness or that sense that you're going to start crying and humiliate yourself, which is what's overwhelming. But if you know, I can get up at any point, usually the grief trigger passes fairly quickly. But you should also help minimize them and anticipate them. So if you're going to do an activity on Father's Day, one of the clips I often show is about a kid, and he talked about when he was in kindergarten, they were doing some Father's Day activity with bookmarks, and they were going to write things about their dad. And they wrote father, and then they wrote something for F, something for A. And he said, and I was about to start crying because I couldn't do one. So he went into the bathroom and cried by himself in the bathroom. That's not really adequate support for grieving kids. So before you have that assignment on Father's Day, you can just say to kids, tomorrow or, on Friday, we're going to do a project that deals with Father's Day. And I'm going to ask you to create a bookmark and use memories of your dad. Some of you may not have a dad who's alive now, or who is at least currently living with you. And you can still draw on your memories of your dad if you have them, or you could just pick another man in your life that's important and do it thinking about that individual. That way we can all participate fully. Please let me know if you have any questions after class and we can talk about that. So it's respectful, not just about the people who died, but also the people who are not available. So they could be a dad that's incarcerated or is deployed or has severe substance use and is no longer engaged with the family. We need to be able to help kids with all of those losses. So right now, due to the wildfires, there are many losses. They aren't all death. So just to end, supporting grieving students is really important, and it can be very gratifying work, but it does come at a price to professionals. Exposure to trauma and suffering of others can lead, for example, to compassion fatigue. Compassion requires empathy. You need to be able to understand the feelings of someone else, but it goes beyond that. It's when you want to help and desire to relieve the suffering of another. So the word compassion has two Latin roots which mean to bear or suffer together. And it's that element of sharing people's suffering that leads people to talk about compassion fatigue, which tends to imply it's exhausting. And if you care too much or about too many people, you're going to just run out of your compassion and hurt yourself in the process. But compassionate approaches to care actually are gratifying. They bring meaning to the work we do. And as such, they can actually decrease burnout. But that really only occurs when professionals have realistic objectives of the reason for their interactions. If you're trying to help someone who's grieving or coping with a disaster, you're not there to make them happy. You're there to help them begin to process something difficult. You also have to be aware of and have sufficient support to deal with the personal impact of that work on you. It does require emotional effort, but it's like physical exercise. It's exhausting initially when you start an exercise plan, but you build that capacity over time and you build your exercise over time. And then it brings you then have success. But that really means you have to be aware of the impact it's having on you and practice professional self-care. So all students benefit from well-trained and empathic adults around them, and that includes school educators. And that's why the Coalition to Support Grieving Students was established. The lead founding members were my National Center and the New York Life Foundation that provided the support. And then we convened the two teachers unions, the AFT and the NEA, School Superintendents Association, and American Federation of School Administrators, as well as the major organizations for school counselors, nurses, social workers, and school psychologists. We started working together a decade ago. We actually will be celebrating our 10-year anniversary on November 1st. There's a day of learning and a celebration in New York. You can participate remotely. It does start at 11 a.m., so that's like 5 a.m. your time, but you can catch part of it. It goes on until 4 p.m. East Coast time, so there's still things you can join in. But we launched a free website, which I will end by telling you about. But when we launched that in 2015, over 100 other organizations have joined. So we have at this point about over 135 professional organizations: American Academy of Pediatrics, Boys and Girls Club, Save the Children, National PTA. And you can go to grievingstudents.org, and you'll see a menu at the top that has drop down over 21 video-based modules, and you can also order free materials.
We have a lot of resources on the website, which I won't go over. A lot of them are bilingual. And you can also, here's one example. After a loved one dies, this is for parents and other caregivers of grieving children. It's available in hard copy in English and Spanish. And when you order it, it is free of charge, and the shipping and handling is free of charge. You can also download it in PDF in 9 languages now. So you'll find that information on the website as well. And I'm going to end with my contact information and then open it up to see if there are any questions that came in. So Vanessa, I'm going to turn it over to you.
No, there's no questions that was in, but just the things that you were talking about, people are just commenting how they never thought about it like that.
Well, good.
I have a question. I'm Jessica with the Wailuku Public Library. So I'm not a healthcare professional or a social service worker, but as a librarian, I'm very grateful for this training, but also how, if it's possible to create tools for caregivers that help them cope with grief in terms of books, because that's what I do know about, and wanting to create something that's very mindful of what you just shared, and connects them not only to community resources, but I find that like reading together is a very healing process. So I'm wondering if there are any examples of grief kits or things that I could even create in my own library to lend to families or even to give away.
Yeah, great. So there is a program. I wasn't going to go over that here, but I'll just mention it to you. It's called the Grief Sensitive Schools Initiative. So schools can get a brief presentation. It's about 20 minutes long by an employee of New York Life that are ambassadors. They're trained as ambassadors. There's over 1,000 of them across the country, including in Hawaii. I actually spoke with one of the New York Life people in Honolulu this week, like maybe 2 days ago. They are there in Hawaii. There was some discussion of trying to do it in Hawaii. And what happens is if you hear the 20-minute presentation, if 5 people attend for a school, they actually qualify for a $500 grant. And to use as they wish to get books, to do whatever they would like to try and support grieving kids. And it can be aggregated across the school district. So New York City stands to get, because they're a grief-sensitive school district now, they stand to get somewhere between $800,000 and $900,000. So if you're a really big school district, you can get a lot. Now, the reason I'm going over this in answer to your question is we are now pilot testing the Grief Sensitive Schools Initiative Plus, which is out of school programs, which includes libraries. So they're now pilot testing it to do this with libraries as well as after-school camps, etc. So I'm actually speaking next in a couple weeks to the peer learning group that's starting that piloting of it. So I know there already are programs that are working with libraries, and they're wonderful locations, not only to get books that can be used by families to start the conversation, but also to be a supportive and nurturing environment. Families come in to be able to guide them to resources to help them. So you should look at the videos. So like if you find out someone's there, they're looking for something to read about, there's a funeral, I don't know what I should do. There is a module. These modules are like 10 minutes long. You can watch the one on funeral attendance or academic problems, and then you can give advice. That booklet, after a loved one dies, you can stock them for your library and hand them out for free. But there also are other resources. I tend not to try and identify particular books for different age groups, because I'm going to be candid with you, they go out of print pretty quickly. And my experience is that children's librarians already know them. So I worked with one school, and the teachers liked a book that I used, The 10th Good Thing About Barney, and they said, oh, you should get this for the library. So I bought like copies, and I brought it to the librarian. She goes, I'll just put it next to the other copies on the shelf. Like she already knew. If someone had just asked her, she already knew. I find bookstores where the employees actually read the books, and librarians, they just know how to do this. But there are some free children's books that New York Life has put out. If you go to our website and click order free material, you go to the fulfillment center, and there's a series of 3 books for different age groups, and they can be ordered, and they again are free of charge, and the shipping and handling is free of charge. So you can order those books, put them in your library. You can create kits like that. The middle school one just came out within the past year, but they're well-done books that talk about some of these themes. But there are probably thousands of books where death is included and in a way. So just look at them, making sure, does it go over the concepts? Sometimes death is used, but it isn't used in a way that promotes adjustment. It's just used. So, reading a book about people who have been killed does not necessarily help a child process their grief.
Right.
But reading a book of a child being helped who was grieving does. So but I think I would say, better about what books are good.
I do, but I just want to know, this is why I want to be trained a little bit on.
Oh, no, I know. So
how to do
I'm
that.
not being critical. I'm just saying, trust your impressions.
Thank you.
Children's librarians are professionals on books. And so for me to tell you, this book is better, you're going to find, oh, that one's out of print, or actually, I know a better one. And that's okay. So just use some of what I've suggested to look at the book. Does it help them learn the concepts?
Okay.
Or is it confusing? Does it show support? Or does it show a child who's not able? So if I can take one more minute, like if you think about some of the Disney films that are out there, they cover death, but they often do not do it in a good way.
Right.
So just think about Snow White, which is being re-released in a better graphic version or something. I mean, what is this about? A mother dies, the child then becomes part of a blended family. Her stepmother wants her killed because she's too beautiful. And so the coping mechanism that the child uses is not go to talk to the dad, but run into the woods by yourself. She's then taken in by a group of dwarfs, which are hard to find in the woods. And then what happens is her stepmother she's not even satisfied with that. She goes to pursue her and hires someone to cut out her heart and bring the heart back. When that fails, she goes herself. She turns herself into an ugly old hag because we shouldn't respect the elderly or those who are unattractive. She tries to poison her with an apple because why they didn't use candy or something, I don't know, but let's make sure they don't eat fruit or vegetables. And then what happens is she eats the apple, and then she falls into this is what really got me in the movie, an everlasting sleep, and the dwarfs, thinking she is dead, will bury her alive. Now that is really frightening to children. So in the movie theater, I'm saying to my daughter, we do not bury people alive. She was like 4, and she was in my office. She goes, Dad, it's just pretend I didn't do that. But anyway, then she starts saying, so what happens is, she isn't buried by the dwarfs because she's so beautiful, even in death, that they put her in a glass coffin to stare at her dead body. And some guy she's never met, who's rich and is royalty and has power, thinks she's so beautiful even while she's dead that he opens the coffin and kisses a dead body, which is really not a practice we want to encourage. And then she wakes up and then decides to marry this guy because he's rich, he has power, and he goes around kissing dead people who are, these stories the kids get exposed to. I'm just using it because death is in children's literature.
It is, yes.
But I think Snow White does it wrong, and in many ways. And so use your gut,
I will.
in your mind. But I'm sorry for going over a couple minutes.
No, thank you. I'm sorry. I wanted to talk to you, so thank you very much.